At 72, you gave your son everything. But at the dinner table, he looked at you and said, "It's her house now." Pain. Betrayal. A silence colder than death. Yet instead of breaking, this mother rose and revealed the real will. This isn't just about property, it's about strength, love, and the final line of self-defense. Part 1, The Last Family Dinner. My name is Hattie Mae Washington, and I am 72 years old. At my age, you learn that the most important stories aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones that unfold in rooms you thought were safe. This is one of those stories. It's the story of my son, a dining room table, and a will that wasn't what he thought it was. It began, as so many endings do, with a family dinner. A Tuesday. The air was heavy with the scent of Arthur's favorite roast chicken. A scent that used to mean time's home, asterisk. Now, it just felt like a ghost in the room. Across the oak table my husband built, my son, Marcus, stared intently into his glass of iced tea, as if it held the answers to a question he was terrified to ask. His wife, Chloe, sat beside him, a picture of false sweetness. She was the conductor of this silent, dreadful orchestra. I could feel it. She'd been hinting for weeks. Little comments dropped like poison into a well. This big house must be so much for you. Hattie, we should really simplify your finances. Make things easier for you. I'd nod and smile. But each word was a little crack in the foundation of my life. Tonight, the hints were over. Hattie, Chloe began, her voice smooth as silk, but her eyes were hard as stones. Mark has something he needs to discuss with you. About the future. She placed her perfectly manicured hand on his arm. A silent command. Marcus flinched. He was 45. A man who managed millions for other people. But under his wife's touch, he looked like a boy caught stealing. He finally dragged his eyes up to meet mine. "Mom," his voice was a hoarse whisper. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. "We've been talking, Chloe and I, and, well, we think it's for the best." I didn't help him. I just waited. I held my hands steady in my lap. My back straight against the chair Arthur always said was mine. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. He finally broke, the words spilling out in a rush, as if saying them fast would make them hurt less. "The house. Mom, it's a lot for you. The upkeep. The taxes. Chloe is so good with these things." He gestured vaguely with a hand that was shaking. "It just makes sense to transfer things over. For planning, for the future." He couldn't say the words. He looked at Chloe. A desperate, pleading look. Her smile sharpened. She picked up the thread without a moment's hesitation, her voice laced with a triumphant sort of pity. "What your son is trying to say, Hattie," she said, looking directly at me, savoring the moment, "is that it's her house now." She gestured to herself with a slight, elegant tilt of her head. Asterisk. It's her house now. There it was. The blow I knew was coming. But it still knocked the wind out of me. For a second, the room tilted. The scent of rosemary. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. With the weight of Arthur's absence, it all swirled together into a dizzying vortex of loss. But then, a strange thing happened. The dizziness passed. The roaring in my ears faded, replaced by a profound and icy calm. The part of me that was a grieving widow retreated. And the part of me that was a history teacher, the part that had studied empires rise and fall, the part that knew all about strategy and betrayal, that part took over. My Arthur always said, "Trust is the foundation, Tatty." But even the strongest foundation needs to be checked after a storm. I just never realized the storm wasn't outside the walls. It was sitting at my table, using my silverware. I looked at my son, my only child. I saw the shame warring with the weakness in his eyes. He wasn't a monster. He was just a disappointment. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I met Chloe's triumphant gaze with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "Well," I said, my voice even and clear, "that is certainly one version of the future." I pushed my chair back from the table, The scraping sound it made on the hardwood floor was the only noise in the room. Since we're discussing final arrangements, I continued, my voice level, I suppose this is as good a time as any. I have a document to share as well. It's the Times Real Times will, the one your father and I prepared for a moment just like this. Part 2. The cracks in the foundation. To understand how we arrived at that silent battlefield of a dinner table, you have to go back a year. Back to the quiet. After we buried Arthur, the silence was the loudest thing in our big 4-bedroom house on Maple Street. It was a physical presence. It sat in his empty armchair in the den. It echoed in the garage where his tools hung, perfectly clean, waiting for a hand that would never hold them again. For 48 years, my life had a soundtrack: Arthur's booming laugh, his off-key whistling, the constant low hum of the news on his radio. And then, it was just quiet. I'd find myself walking from room to room, touching the things he'd loved, the worn leather of his recliner, the smooth, cool wood of the bookshelf he built. Each object was a memory, a testament to a life well lived, a love well tended. But memories are cold comfort in an empty house. Grief is a heavy coat. And in that silence, it felt suffocating. Marcus and Chloe came by every few days. They brought casseroles and foil pans and told me I needed to eat. They'd sit with me for an hour, their conversation bright and brittle, like thin glass. I tried. I really did. I asked Marcus about his work, about the stock market. I complimented Chloe on her new haircut, but we were all just playing parts. My part was the grieving but gracious widow. Theirs was the dutiful son and daughter-in-law. The performance exhausted me. It was on a Sunday, about 2 months after the funeral, that they made their proposal. I was standing in the kitchen, staring out at Arthur's rose garden. It was already getting overgrown. He'd always been the one with the patient hands for roses. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice gentle. He came to stand beside me at the window. Chloe followed, placing a soft hand on my shoulder. "We've been worried about you, all alone in this big place. It's too much." "Hattie," Chloe added, her voice dripping with concern. "The upkeep, the memories, it must be so hard." I didn't say anything. I just watched a fat bumblebee lumber from one neglected rose to another. "Sell the house." "Mom," Marcus said. The words hung in the air, just as his other, more terrible words would a year later. "Sell it. Take the money. Put it away. Come live with us. We have that beautiful guest suite downstairs. It has its own entrance. You'd have your privacy, but you'd have family right here. A new start for all of us. A new start." The idea was a lifeline, a way out of the silence. I imagined waking up to the smell of coffee someone else had made. I imagined hearing footsteps that weren't just my own. I imagined not being so terribly, achingly alone. Grief makes you vulnerable. It lowers your defenses. It makes you want to believe in simple solutions. So I said yes. Selling the house on Maple Street felt like tearing out a chapter of my own life. Every packed box, every wrapped piece of china was a goodbye. We'd raised Marcus in that house. We'd hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners and 4th of July barbecues. Arthur and I had grown old together within those walls. But I told myself it was for the best. I was moving toward family, toward the future. The house we moved into, the one in the new, pristine suburb, was Chloe's dream. All clean lines, gray walls, and glass. It was beautiful, I suppose, but it had no soul. My sturdy, dark wood furniture from the old house looked out of place, like a history professor at a nightclub. "Oh, Hattie," Chloe said one afternoon, running a hand over the back of Arthur's armchair as the movers set it down. "This is classic, but maybe we can find a nice slipcover, something a little more contemporary." I just smiled. "It was your father-in-law's favorite chair," was all I said. That was the first red flag, a small one, fluttering in the breeze, but a flag nonetheless. Then came the questions. They started casually. Marcus would sit with me in the evenings, a glass of bourbon in his hand, "Just making sure your finances are all in order, Mom," he'd say. Dad was always so organized. Did he have a preferred broker? Just want to make sure his portfolio is being managed properly? I answered his questions. He was my son. After all, he was in finance. It seemed logical, prudent. Chloe's questions were different, more subtle. She'd be helping me unpack a box of old photo albums. My goodness. Arthur was so handsome, she'd say, tapping a picture of him in his army uniform. He must have been a wonderful provider. He and his partner built quite a business, didn't they? I told her the stories. I was proud of my husband, proud of the life we'd built. I didn't see the careful, calculating light in her eyes. I saw what I wanted to see, a daughter-in-law taking an interest in her new family's history, the real warning bell, the one that finally shook me from my grief-stricken haze. Rang about 6 months after I'd moved in. I was paying some bills at the small desk they'd set up for me in my suite. Chloe came in with a cup of tea. Just thought you might like this, she said, her smile as sweet as the tea she was offering. She watched me sign a check for the electric company. She lingered for a moment, then asked, her voice light and airy, "You know, I was just thinking, Arthur was so thorough. Did he have a really clear will and everything all set up? It's just so important these days." The question was like a splash of cold water. It wasn't the question itself, but the way she asked it, the casual, almost hungry curiosity behind the word. It wasn't about being prudent. It was about finding something out. I looked up from my checkbook and met her eyes. For the first time, I didn't see a caring daughter-in-law. I saw a prospector panning for gold. I gave her a slow, warm smile, the kind of smile a 72-year-old woman who has taught American history to teenagers for 40 years has perfected, a smile that says, "I see you. Oh, of course, dear," I said, my voice just as light as hers. Arthur was the most thorough man I've ever known. He left nothing to chance. Absolutely nothing. She held my gaze for a second too long. A flicker of something frustration, suspicion in her eyes, before her sweet smile snapped back into place. "That's wonderful to hear," she said. And then she was gone. I sat there for a long time after she left, the pen still in my hand. The tea sat on the desk, untouched, growing cold. The foundation of my new life, the one I had so desperately wanted to believe in, had just revealed its first, undeniable crack, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the soul, that it wouldn't be the last. Part 3: The Secret Shield. That little seed of doubt, planted by Chloe's careless question about the will, didn't just sprout. It grew into a thorny, strangling vine in the quiet of my heart. For 2 weeks, I watched them. I listened. I became a historian in my own home, observing the subtle shifts in alliances, the secret whispers, the coded glances over the dinner table. I saw the way Chloe's hand would rest on Marcus's arm, not with affection, but with the firm grip of a rider holding the reins. I saw the mail change suddenly. Letters from banks with logos I didn't recognize started arriving for my son, quickly hidden away before I could see. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the deep, dark circles of a man being pulled under by a current too strong for him to fight. One Thursday afternoon, after they'd both left him to his office, her to what she called a charity luncheon, I stood in the quiet kitchen and knew I couldn't just watch anymore. Arthur wouldn't have just watched. He would have acted. My hands were steady as I picked up the old landline phone, the one with the heavy receiver that felt solid in your palm. My cell phone felt too flimsy for a call like this. I dialed the number from memory, a number I hadn't had to call for over a year. Vance and Associates. A crisp voice answered. "Eleanor." "Please," I said, my own voice low and even. "Tell her it's Hattie. They're our friends. And then there is Eleanor Vance. We met in college. 2 young black women trying to make our way in a world that wasn't always ready for us. She went into law, and I went into teaching history. But we were both fighters, just in different arenas. She was the one I'd called the night Arthur's heart gave out. She was the one who sat with me on my porch swing until the sun came up, saying nothing, which was everything I needed. "Hattie, are you all right?" Her voice came on the line, sharp with concern, cutting through the professional chatter. "I'm fine. Eleanor, I need to see the paperwork." The trust. Can we meet somewhere quiet? She didn't ask why. A true friend never has to. The teacup on Main Street, 1 hour. She said, I'll bring the file. The teacup was a little place tucked between an antique shop and a bookstore. A place that smelled of old paper and Earl Grey tea. It was quiet. Anonymous. I sat in a booth in the back, the worn vinyl cool against my skin, and waited. Eleanor arrived looking exactly as she always did, impeccable in a navy blue suit. Her silver hair cut in a sharp, no-nonsense bob. She carried a handsome, dark brown leather portfolio. She slid into the booth opposite me, her eyes scanning my face, taking everything in. Talk to me. Hattie, she said softly, placing the portfolio on the table between us. It sat there like a sleeping guard dog, and I did. I told her everything. The little comments from Chloe, the strange mail, the desperate look in my son's eyes. As I spoke, I felt a weight I didn't even know I was carrying begin to lift. Just a little. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. She just nodded, her expression grim. Then, she untied the leather straps on the portfolio and opened it. Arthur was a good man, she said, her voice full of respect. He was also a smart one. He loved Marcus. But he wasn't blind. He saw the boy's ambition, and he saw Chloe's influence. She pulled out a thick document, bound in a heavy blue cover, the Washington Family Irrevocable Living Trust, a shield, forged years ago by love and foresight. He insisted on this, Eleanor said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the cover. Irrevocable. It means it can't be changed or dissolved without a court order and proof of extreme circumstances. No one can just sign it away, not even you. I felt a wave of relief so strong my shoulders sagged. I had a shield, but the relief was followed by a sharp, piercing pain. A shield meant there was a battle, and the enemy was my own son. There are 2 clauses in particular you need to remember. Hattie, Eleanor continued, her voice turning crisp and professional. She put on her reading glasses and turned to a specific page marked with a yellow tab. First is the caretaker clause. It's simple. It states that for Marcus to inherit this house and the controlling interest in the trust, he must serve as your primary, good faith caretaker for the remainder of your natural life. Any attempt to place you in a facility against your will, any sign of neglect, or any action that places you under emotional or financial duress constitutes a violation of the trust. I stared at the black ink on the page. We had put that clause in to ensure I'd be loved and cared for, not to use as a weapon. The bitterness of it tasted like acid in my throat. And then, Eleanor said, flipping a page, there's this one. Arthur called it his rainy day clause. Her voice softened. The financial stewardship clause. There was a court of the fine elated to president, was last of getting on the speedy as in the wave. She looked at me over her glasses. It stipulates that the beneficiary, Marcus, must maintain a state of good financial standing. He's required to be free of significant consumer debt, tax lien, or any judgments against him resulting from, and I quote, reckless or speculative financial ventures. A violation would transfer control of the trust to the successor trustee. I finally understood. The desperate, hunted look in my son's eyes. The hidden letters. It wasn't just greed. It was desperation. He hadn't just stumbled, he had fallen. And now, he and his wife were trying to use my life's work, my home, as a ladder to climb out of the hole they had dug for themselves. The waitress came and refilled my cup of tea. It had gone cold. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, trying to draw some heat into my suddenly icy fingers. I had the shield. It was stronger than I had remembered. But oh, Lord, it was heavy. Looking back, holding that knowledge was like carrying a loaded gun in my own home. It was a terrible, lonely secret. It makes me wonder, have you ever had to make a plan to protect yourself from the very people you love the most? If you feel comfortable, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Reading your stories helps me feel a little less alone on this journey. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. What do you want to do? Hattie. I looked out the window at the people walking by on the street. living their ordinary lives. I thought of the boy who used to fall asleep with his head in my lap. I thought of the man who now wouldn't meet my eyes. Nothing, I said, and my voice was clear and steady. I'm going to do nothing. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I'm going home, I explained, my resolve hardening with every word. I will continue to be his mother. I will wait. I will watch. And I will let them play their hand. I need to see for myself just how far my son is willing to go. Part 4. The drama at the dining table. So now, we are back. Back at the dining room table, the air thick with the ghosts of words spoken and unspoken. The roast chicken sits between us, a forgotten centerpiece in a play that has taken a very dark turn. Before the bomb dropped, Chloe had been playing her part beautifully. She'd laughed a little too loudly at a joke Marcus told. She'd complimented my gravy, calling it legendary, a word she'd never used before. She'd touched my hand when she passed the bread basket, her fingers cool against my skin. It was a masterful performance of a happy family. But I've taught history long enough to know the signs of a coming coup, the false smiles, the overly friendly gestures. They are always the prelude to betrayal. I watched my son. He barely ate. He moved the food around on his plate, creating little canyons in his mashed potatoes. He drank his iced tea in long, nervous gulps. He was a man being led to the gallows, and his wife was holding the rope. And then she gave him the little nudge with her eyes, the signal, and he spoke the word. This is her house now. Mom? The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to stop ticking. The world held its breath. I felt the shock. Yes, a cold, sharp stab deep in my chest. But beneath it, there was something else. A strange, quiet clarity. The moment I had been dreading, the one I had been preparing for in secret, had finally arrived. The board was set. The pieces were in motion, and it was my turn to move. I did not look at Chloe. To look at her would be to acknowledge her victory, and she had not won, not yet. I kept my eyes fixed on my son, only on Marcus. He was looking down again, at his plate, at his hands, anywhere but at the wreckage he had just created. He looked small, diminished. I let the silence stretch. I let it become uncomfortable. I let him stew in it. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low. I was surprised at how steady it sounded. Why? Just that one word. He flinched, as if I had struck him. He didn't answer. Chloe started to speak. Hattie, it's not about... I held up a single hand. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. It stopped her mid-sentence. My eyes never left Marcus. I'm talking to my son, I said, my voice still quiet. Still, I waited. The clock in the hall started ticking again. Each tick was an eternity. Mom, it's complicated, he finally stammered, his gaze still glued to the table. Uncomplicate it for me. Marcus, I said. The history teacher in me was coming out now. The one who would stand in front of a classroom and refuse to move on until a student gave a proper answer. I'm a 72-year-old woman. I appreciate simplicity. He swallowed hard. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. It's for your own good, he said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. This house, it's a big responsibility. The taxes, the upkeep. We don't want you to have to worry about all that. We want to take care of you. Take care of me, I repeated. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I let the words hang there, letting him hear how absurd they sounded. Taking care of me by taking my home. And it's about planning. He pushed on, gaining a desperate sort of momentum. Estate planning. It's just cleaner this way. Legally. It simplifies things for the future. For that would be redundant, right? Later. I echoed. The word was a euphemism for my own death. He was planning for my death while I was still sitting right in front of him. My heart still beating. I picked up my water glass. My hand was perfectly steady. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I set the glass down without a sound. All the while, I watched him. I watched the shame rise in his cheeks like a fever. I watched him crumble under the weight of his own lies, under the silent pressure of his mother's gaze. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own weakness, and his wife was the anchor tied to his feet. He had no more words. He had run out of excuses. There was nothing left but the ugly truth. Sitting there between us, the performance was over. I looked at him. My son, this stranger wearing his face, and I felt a profound and weary sadness. Sadness for the boy he had been, sadness for the man he had failed to become. But sadness does not mean weakness. I folded my cloth napkin. I placed it neatly beside my plate, next to the untouched chicken. The meal was officially over. I looked from Marcus's downcast face to Chloe's impatient, triumphant one. "Thank you for your honesty, Marcus," I said, and the cold formality in my voice made him look up at last. Our eyes finally met. In his, I saw a flicker of the little boy I once knew. Lost and terrified, I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. A loud, jarring sound in the quiet room. "Your father and I also had a plan for the future," I said, my voice resonating with a strength I hadn't realized I had. A very thorough one. I turned away from the table, away from their shocked faces. "Let me go get it." Part 5. Reading the Will. I walked out of the dining room. My steps were measured, deliberate. I didn't rush. I could feel their eyes on my back. A mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. I went into the den, to the heavy oak bookshelf that Arthur had built. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of history textbooks, was a dark blue leather portfolio. It was cool and smooth to the touch. It felt heavy in my hands. Heavy with the weight of foresight, of love, of a difficult truth. When I returned, they were sitting exactly as I had left them, frozen in a tableau of greed and guilt. The air was thick with unspoken questions. I sat back down in my chair at the head of the table. I placed the portfolio in front of me. I didn't open it right away. First, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and took out my reading glasses. I unfolded them slowly. I polished the lenses with a corner of my napkin. I settled them onto my nose. Every movement was a small act of power, a reclamation of the authority they had tried to strip from me. Chloe watched me, a tight, dismissive smile playing on her lips. She thought this was a pathetic little show, an old woman clinging to a meaningless piece of paper. I finally opened the portfolio. The document inside was thick, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper. I cleared my throat, not because I needed to, but to draw their full attention. "This," I began, my voice clear and steady as a church bell on a Sunday morning, "is the Washington Family Irrevocable Living Trust, executed by myself, Hattie Mae Washington, and my late husband, Arthur James Washington, 5 years ago. It supersedes any simple will." I saw a flicker of unease in Chloe's eyes. Marcus just looked numb. "Your father was a builder," I said, looking at my son. He knew the importance of a strong foundation, and he knew that, sometimes, the biggest threats to a structure come from the inside. I ran my finger down the first page. Let me read you a relevant section. It is titled Article 4 Conditions of Inheritance for Primary Beneficiary. Marcus Allen Washington. I paused, letting the formal, legal language settle into the room. Clause A, the caretaker clause. My voice was rhythmic, measured. The primary beneficiary shall inherit the full assets of the trust only upon the condition that he has provided his surviving parent, Hattie Mae Washington, with diligent, respectful, and unwavering emotional and physical care. Any action taken to prematurely institutionalize, emotionally coerce, or dispossess the surviving parent of her primary residence shall be considered a material breach of this clause. I looked up over the rims of my glasses. Chloe actually scoffed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. "That's ridiculous. We times are times taking care of you. This is what taking care of you looks like." "Is it?" I asked softly, then turned my attention back to the document, dismissing her completely. "But it's the next clause that I think you'll find most educational." My finger moved down the page. Clause B, the Financial Stewardship Clause. I let the title hang in the air for a moment. The primary beneficiary must demonstrate, to the satisfaction of the trustee, a consistent pattern of responsible personal financial management. Any evidence of catastrophic investment losses due to gross negligence, the accumulation of significant unsecured debt, or any other behavior that jeopardizes the financial stability built by the grantors, shall also be considered a material breach of this trust. I let a deep, profound silence fill the room. I didn't need to raise my voice. The words on the page were doing all the work. I slowly took my glasses off. I folded them. I placed them beside the portfolio. I looked directly at my son. And this time, there was nowhere for him to hide. I know about the Charlotte deal, Marcus. The words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they landed like a physical blow. His head snapped up. The color drained from his face. All the fight, all the pretense, just evaporated. He looked utterly and completely broken. The real estate venture your partners pulled out of 6 months ago, I continued, my voice devoid of emotion. A simple recitation of facts. The one you poured all your savings into, the one you took out a second mortgage on your own home for, without telling Chloe, the one that failed. He made a small, wounded sound in the back of his throat. He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Disbelief not that it had happened, but that times I knew that his quiet, and a mine with 5 tens with hid bought, gardening. 72-year-old mother knew the precise details of his ruin. Your father taught you to build things, Marcus, I said, the sadness finally seeping into my voice. Not to gamble them away. That was it. That was the final crack in his dam of denial. He crumpled. It's the only word for it. He put his face in his hands and his shoulders began to shake in silent, racking sobs, the sound of a man who had not only lost his future, but had just been confronted by the ghost of his father's disappointment. I thought, for a moment, that the battle was over, but I had forgotten about Chloe. She didn't move to comfort her weeping husband. She didn't look shocked. She looked furious. A cold, hard rage had replaced the dismissive smile. Her face was a mask of pure venom. She stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her eyes blazing. You think this is about money, she shrieked, her voice raw and ugly. You think this is just about some failed deal. She let out a laugh that had no humor in it, a laugh that was all broken glass and jagged edges. You have no idea what your husband did. She spat. You have times no idea, times what this family owes mine. Part 6, The Buried Grudge. Marcus was still crying, his face buried in his hands. A broken man at his own mother's table, but I wasn't looking at him anymore. My attention was entirely on Chloe. She stood there, vibrating with a rage so intense it seemed to suck the very air out of the room. The mask of the sweet, caring daughter-in-law had not just slipped, it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. What was left was something raw and ugly, something I had never seen before. Your husband was no saint, Hattie, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. He wasn't some benevolent builder. He was a shark in a tool belt, and he devoured my father whole. I stared at her, genuinely bewildered. What are you talking about? Oh, don't you play dumb with me, she sneered. Don't you act like you don't remember Frank Keller, my father, Franklin Keller Construction. The name was a ghost from a distant past. Franklin Keller, yes. I remembered him. A small, wiry man with an easy smile and ambitious eyes. He and Arthur had partnered on a project, a big one. Back in the late 90s, they were partners, I said slowly. The pieces of a forgotten history beginning to surface in my mind. Partners. Chloe let out another one of those terrible, humorless laughs. That's what your husband called it. My father called it a slaughter. He called it the day Arthur Washington slit his throat with a contract and a handshake. My mind raced back, trying to assemble the faded photographs of memory. The project, yes. It was called Riverwood Estates. It was the development that had cemented Arthur's reputation. The one that had allowed us to build the house on Maple Street. The one that paid for Marcus's college education. It had been a massive success for us. But for Frank Keller, the deal went south for your father, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Arthur said he overextended himself. He said Frank made some bad choices. took on too much risk, bad choices. Chloe's voice rose to a near scream. Your husband offered him a way out, a buyout that was pennies on the dollar. Take this pittance, he said. Or lose everything when the bank forecloses. He used my father's desperation against him. He built this entire comfortable life of yours on the rubble of my family's dreams. I remembered now. I remembered Arthur coming home late for weeks. His face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He'd sit in his armchair, staring into the fireplace even when there was no fire. One night, I'd asked him what was wrong. He'd shaken his head, his voice heavy with a sadness I couldn't quite understand at the time. I lost a friend today. Hattie, he'd said. Or maybe I never had one. He made a bad bet, and he's blaming me for his losing hand. There was nothing else I could do. A bad bet. A losing hand. That was Arthur's side of the story. A slaughter. A slit throat. That was Frank Keller's, and his daughter was standing in my dining room. Her face twisted with 2 decades of inherited hatred. My father lost everything. Chloe continued, her voice trembling with a righteous fury. The business. The house. His pride. He died a broken man 5 years later. Still talking about the day Arthur Washington betrayed him. I was 22 when it happened, and I made a promise to him at his funeral. I promised him I would get it all back. I would get back what the Washingtons took from us. Every last dime. A cold dread, colder than anything I had felt before, washed over me. This wasn't about a house. This wasn't about money. This was a vendetta, a long, patient, meticulously planned campaign of revenge. Marcus slowly lifted his head from his hands. He looked at his wife, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. He wasn't just a disappointment to his mother, he was a pawn. A means to an end. The key that opened the door for the enemy to walk right in. His marriage, his life, it had all been a lie. A carefully constructed stage for this final act. Chloe, he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Is that why you... She didn't even look at him. Her eyes, burning with a feverish intensity, were still locked on me. It took me years, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Years to meet him. Years to make him fall in love with me. Years to gain his trust. To gain your times trust. And it was all worth it for this one moment. The moment I could sit at your table, in your house, and tell you that it all belongs to me now. To a Keller. The room was silent, save for Marcus's ragged breathing. The air was thick with the poison of a feud I never even knew existed. A war that had been waged in secret was now out in the open, and my dining room was the final, bloody battlefield. Just then, a sound cut through the tension, clear and precise. The chime of the doorbell. Chloe and Marcus both jumped, but I didn't. I had been waiting for it. I looked at the clock on the wall. 7:30. Exactly. I turned my calm gaze back to my daughter-in-law, whose face was a mask of confusion and rage. Right on time, I said. Part 7. The Executor of Justice. The doorbell chimed. The sound was soft, melodic, but it cut through the hate-filled air in the dining room like a judge's gavel. Chloe froze mid-sentence, her face a twisted mask of fury. Marcus looked up from his hands, his expression hollow and lost. For a single, frozen moment, there was absolute silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Right on time, I said, my voice quiet. I didn't get up. I just looked toward the front hall as I heard the familiar sound of the door opening. I had given Eleanor a key a week ago. She appeared in the archway of the dining room a moment later. My Eleanor. She's 70. Same as me. But she carries herself with the unshakable authority of a woman who has spent 40 years navigating the treacherous waters of the law. She wore a simple, dark gray suit, and her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like justice itself. Come to call, her eyes, sharp and intelligent behind her glasses, swept the room. They took in the half-eaten dinner, the tension thick as molasses, Chloe's furious stance, and Marcus's broken form. Her gaze rested for a moment on me, a flicker of deep, unwavering friendship in her eyes. And then she turned her full attention to my son. She did not even acknowledge Chloe's presence. Marcus, she said, Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. It was a voice accustomed to commanding courtrooms and boardrooms. It was a voice that did not brook argument. "Eleanor," Marcus whispered, looking up at her like a condemned man seeing the chaplain. "I am here tonight in my official capacity," Eleanor stated, walking calmly to the table. She placed her leather briefcase on the floor beside her and clicked it open. As stipulated in Article 7 of the Washington Family Trust, in the event of a material breach by the primary beneficiary, I am activated as the successor trustee. She looked from Marcus's pale face to Chloe's defiant one. "What that means, in simple terms," she continued, her voice devoid of any emotion, "is that as of this moment, I hold full legal authority over all assets contained within the trust, this house included." Chloe let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You can't be serious. We live here. This is our home. You can't just—" Eleanor held up a hand, the same way I had done earlier, but her gesture had the full weight of the law behind it. Chloe fell silent. From her briefcase, Eleanor pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. She laid them on the table with a soft, final thud. "This," she said, tapping the top page, "is a formal notification of the breach of contract, citing both Clause 4 Amperes and 4B. It has already been filed with the county court." She slid a second document across the table toward them. "This is an official notice to vacate. As trustee, I am legally obligated to protect the assets of the trust. That includes the primary residence. You have 48 hours to remove your personal belongings." 48 hours. The words echoed in the silent room. "And finally," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to an even colder, more clinical tone, "this is a court order, signed by Judge Miller this afternoon, placing a temporary freeze on all joint financial accounts held by Marcus and Chloe Washington, pending a full forensic audit to determine if any trust assets were improperly leveraged or commingled." That was the final blow. I watched Chloe's face. The fury was still there, but now it was laced with something new. Panic. Raw, undisguised panic. Her plan, her 20-year quest for revenge, had not just failed. It had backfired in the most spectacular way, threatening to take her down with it. "This is illegal," Chloe spat, her voice rising. "You can't do this. He's her son. We'll sue. We'll take this to court and we'll tell them she's a senile old woman being manipulated." "You are welcome to try," Eleanor interrupted, her voice dangerously calm. "But let me be clear. Every document is ironclad. Every action I am taking is not only legal but is my fiduciary duty. Any legal challenge you mount will be met with the full resources of the trust. And I assure you, those resources are considerable." She looked at Chloe then, truly looked at her for the first time, and the dismissive power in that gaze was absolute. "Any further communications from you or your legal counsel can be directed to my office," Eleanor said. "Our conversation here is concluded." She turned to me, her expression softening for the first time. "Hattie, I'll be in the den when you're ready." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving a crater of silence in her wake. The scent of her leather briefcase and the crisp smell of legal paper seemed to hang in the air, overpowering the now cold scent of the roast chicken. The family dinner was over. The verdict had been delivered. In that moment, watching the ruin of my son and the fury of his wife, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a sense of victory. I just felt an immense, hollow emptiness. The foundation was secure. Yes, the house was safe. But the family that was supposed to live in it was gone forever. If you are still listening to my story, here in the quiet, I want to ask you for something. Please, leave a comment with the word "here" below. Just that one word. It will let me know that you are still here, walking with me on this difficult journey. Your presence, even from far away, is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part of what happened to my home, to my son, and to what was left after the storm. Part 8. Liberation in the Ruins. For a long time after Eleanor left, no one moved. The three of us were suspended in the wreckage, like figures in a photograph of a disaster. The legal papers lay on the table, stark and white against the dark wood. They were the tombstone of our family. It was Chloe who broke the silence. Her panic had subsided, replaced by the hard, sharp glitter of a cornered animal. She turned on Marcus, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "Don't just sit there. Marcus, this isn't over. That old woman can't do this to us." He didn't look at her. He was still staring at the spot on the table where Eleanor's briefcase had been. "Did you hear me?" she snapped. "We'll fight this. We'll get our own lawyer. A better one. We can argue undue influence. We can say your mother isn't mentally competent." He slowly lifted his head. He looked at his wife. Really looked at her. And for the first time, I think he saw her not as the beautiful, ambitious woman he'd married, but as the architect of his ruin. The stranger who had used his weakness as a weapon against his own mother. "We," he said. The word was quiet, but it had a new kind of weight to it, a finality. "What do you mean?" Chloe's voice was laced with impatience. "Us, you and me, we're not just going to roll over and let them take everything." He shook his head. A slow, weary motion. "There is no we. Chloe." His voice was stronger now, clearer. The fog of fear and shame seemed to be lifting from him, leaving behind something raw and painful, but real. There never was. "Was there?" he continued, a bitter sort of wonder in his tone. "It was always you, your plan, your revenge. I was just the key, the way you got in the door. Don't be ridiculous." She scoffed, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes now. She was losing control of her primary asset. "I'm your wife. I did this for us, for our future." He let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a terrible sound, the sound of a man seeing his whole life for the lie it was. "Our future," he said. "You mean your time's future? Paid for with my mother's money, built on the ashes of my father's reputation. What a future that would have been." He pushed his chair back. He stood up. He wasn't the broken man who had been sobbing into his hands just minutes before. He was still in pain. Yes, I could see it in the lines around his eyes, in the slump of his shoulders. But he was standing on his own 2 feet. He turned to me. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just looked at me, his mother. And the lifetime of love and disappointment that passed between us in that gaze was more profound than any words. "You were right not to trust me, Mom," he said, his voice quiet and hoarse. "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to erase the wound, but it was the truth. And it was a start." He looked down at his wrist, at the heavy, gold watch he wore. Chloe had given it to him for his 40th birthday, a symbol of the success he was so desperate to project. With a deliberate movement, he unclasped it. The soft click of the mechanism was loud in the silent room. He laid the watch on the table, next to the legal papers. It gleamed under the dining room light, a piece of a life that no longer belonged to him. "I'm done. Chloe," he said, not looking at her. "I'm done with the lies. The debt, all of it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his car keys. The little metal rings jingled softly, and then he did something I never expected. He walked around the table, past his stunned wife, and he walked out of the dining room. He didn't look back. I heard his footsteps in the hall. I heard the front door open. I heard it close, softly, behind him, and then he was gone. Chloe stood there, frozen, staring at the empty doorway. Her perfect plan, her 20-year quest for vengeance, had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a closing door. She had won the battle for my son's loyalty, but in doing so, she had destroyed the man himself, and now he was gone, leaving her with nothing but the consequences. I sat alone at the head of my table, in my silent, empty house. The storm had passed. It had ripped the roof off and torn the walls down, but it was over, and in the devastating quiet that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, a tiny, fragile seed of it. Hope that the son I had lost was, in losing everything, finally on his way to finding himself. Part 9. Dawn, after the storm. It's been 6 months since that night. 6 months since my home became a courtroom. And then, just as quickly, became quiet again. The quiet this time is different from the silence that followed Arthur's passing. That was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with grief. This is a lighter quiet, A clean quiet. It's the sound of a house breathing again after a long fever has broken. Chloe was gone within the 48 hours, Eleanor had stipulated. She didn't fight. I think once her long-nurtured story of revenge was told, once the poison was finally out, there was nothing left inside her. A moving fan came on a Thursday morning. They took the sleek, modern furniture, the soulless glass tables, and the abstract art that always looked to me like angry squiggles. They left no trace, save for a few scuff marks on the floor and a faint, cloying scent of her perfume that took weeks to fade. The divorce papers arrived by courier a month later. Marcus signed them without contest. After the storm, there is the cleanup. I spent the first few weeks just reclaiming my space. I moved Arthur's armchair back to its rightful spot by the window. I put my old, comfortable quilt back on the bed. I spent an entire afternoon in what had been Marcus and Chloe's room, packing away the life he had left behind. It was a strange, painful task. Tucked in the back of his closet, under a pile of expensive sweaters I'd never seen him wear, I found a small, dusty box. Inside were his childhood treasures. A handful of prized marbles, cloudy with age. His first Little League baseball, the leather cracked and stained with Georgia clay. A slightly crooked clay ashtray he'd made for Arthur in a summer camp art class, his small thumbprint still visible on the rim. I sat on the floor of that empty room, holding that lopsided piece of clay in my hands, and for the first time since that terrible night, I allowed myself to weep. I wept for the little boy with the earnest smile and the scraped knees. I wept for the man he never became, and I wept for the mother who had to let him go. In more ways than one, life settled into a new rhythm, a quiet one. I found my solace in the garden. Arthur's roses had been neglected, choked with weeds. I bought new gloves and pruning shears and I went to work. My back ached and my hands got sore, but there was a deep satisfaction in it, untangling the thorny branches, feeding the soil, cutting away the dead wood to make way for new growth. The garden, like me, was healing. Then, about 3 months in, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the address written in an unfamiliar, slightly shaky hand. No return address. My first instinct was a flicker of fear, a leftover shadow from the battle, but my curiosity won out. I opened it. The letter was from Marcus. It wasn't long, just a single page. He wasn't writing to ask for money, or for help, or even for forgiveness. He was just writing. He told me he was in a small town in Tennessee. He didn't say which one. He'd found a job at a lumber yard, working with his hands. Something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, working summers for his father. He said the work was hard, but honest. He lived in a small apartment above a hardware store. He said the rent was cheap. Asterisk, I wake up when the sun rises. Asterisk, he wrote. Asterisk, I eat simple meal. At night, I'm so tired I fall asleep without thinking. I know it's not the life you and Dad planned for me. I know I threw all that away. But I wanted you to know something. Mom, for the first time in my life, I'm not running from myself anymore. There's no one left to impress, no debts to hide. There's just the work. And the quiet. He ended the letter with 3 simple words. I'm sorry. I must have read that letter a dozen times. I took it out to the back porch and sat in the old wooden swing Arthur and I used to share. I held the thin piece of paper in my hands, the paper my son had touched, and I felt something shift inside me. Forgiveness is a complicated word. It's not a switch you can flip. It's more like a slow dawn. For months, all I had felt was the cold, dark night of his betrayal. But now, holding this letter, reading his humble, unadorned words, I could see the first faint sliver of light on the horizon. He hadn't blamed Chloe. He hadn't made excuses. He had taken ownership of his own ruin, and from it, he was trying to build something new, something small and real, something honest. I looked out at the rose garden. The afternoon sun was warm on my face. After weeks of hard work, I could see them, small, tight buds, promising new life on the old, scarred branches. They weren't blooming yet, but they would. In their own time, I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I went inside, my steps feeling lighter than they had in a very long time. I picked up the phone. I knew who I needed to call. When Eleanor answered, her voice was warm and professional as always. "Eleanor," I said, a new sense of purpose in my own voice. "It's Hattie. I've been thinking about the trust. I'd like to make some changes." Part 10. The True Will. It's morning now. The sun is streaming into the den, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The house is quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's not the lonely, echoing silence of grief. It's a peaceful, settled quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a long fever has broken. Eleanor is sitting across from me, in Arthur's old armchair. We've been friends for 50 years. We don't need many words. She just came over with a thermos of coffee and a fresh stack of papers. This time, the papers don't feel like a weapon. They feel like a beginning. "Are you sure about this, Hattie?" she asked me a little while ago. Her sharp lawyer's eyes softened with a friend's concern. I looked out the window, at the rose garden that is slowly coming back to life under my care. I thought of the letter from Marcus, sitting on my bedside table, a simple, handwritten letter on plain paper, telling me about his small apartment, his job at a lumberyard, and the strange, difficult peace he was finding in a life with nothing but what he could earn with his own two hands. "I'm sure, Eleanor," I said, and I was. The original trust was built on love. Yes, but it was also built on a fear of what could go wrong. It was a shield, and it had done its job. But you can't live your life hiding behind a shield. At some point, you have to lay it down and build something new. So, this morning, with Eleanor as my witness, I signed the amendment. The Washington Family Trust has a new purpose now. The house, this beautiful, soulful house, will be sold when I am gone. And the bulk of the money, the fortune that Arthur and I built brick by brick, deal by deal, will not go to our son. It will become the Arthur Washington Educational Fund. It will provide scholarships for young men and women from our part of Atlanta who want to learn a trade, who want to build things, who have strong hands and good hearts but not the means to get started. It will help them build their own foundations. I did leave something for Marcus, a small portion, enough to be a help but not a crutch. It's not an inheritance he is owed. It is a gift, given freely. It will be released to him in 5 years, on the condition that he has remained employed and free of debt. It is not a reward. It is an expression of my hope for him, hope that he continues on the hard path he has chosen for himself. After Eleanor had notarized the last page and packed the papers back into her briefcase, we just sat for a while, sipping our coffee. The sun warmed my face, and in that quiet, peaceful moment, I finally understood. I realized that the real will, the true last testament that Arthur and I had built over 48 years, was never about the house, or the stocks, or the numbers in a bank account. That will was a lesson. A final lesson from a retired history teacher. It's a lesson for parents. Love is not a blank check. It's not about building a soft road for your children to walk on. It's about giving them a compass and a good map, and then having the courage to let them walk their own path. No matter how rough the terrain gets, you cannot carry them. You can only show them the way. It's a reminder for children. A parent's home is not an asset to be claimed. It is an archive of memories. Do not be so focused on the ambitions of your future that you take a sledgehammer to the foundations of your past. That is a house you can never rebuild. And perhaps, it's a truth for the world we live in now. In an age where success is so often measured by what you acquire, the most powerful legacy is what you give away. My legacy will not be the house my son tried to take. It will be the opportunities that house will create for countless others he will never meet. And that is a foundation that no storm can ever wash away. And with that, Hattie Mae Washington's story, a testament to quiet strength and enduring wisdom, comes to a close. Her final decision was one of profound grace, turning a painful betrayal into a legacy of hope for others. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What do you think of Hattie's choice? If you were in her shoes, having faced the same heartbreak, would you have done anything differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly read every single one, and your perspectives bring these stories to life in a way I could never do alone. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something deep in your heart, please take a moment to leave a like, Share it with someone you know who appreciates a story with real soul. And most importantly, subscribe to Executor Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss the powerful journeys we have yet to share. Thank you for spending your time here with us today. I'll see you in the next story, and who knows, perhaps the next story will be about you.